Arlecchino is perhaps one of the most hyped up Fontaine characters we have gotten, and her kit seems to be one of the most interesting we have ever seen. So let's dive in, shall we? And of course, we start with the character's role in a team. What does she want to do? Arlecchino is a Pyro Polearm DPS who uses Bond of Life to enhance and infuse her attacks. And I'll try my best to simplify her kit for you, because oh boy, this took me 4 rereads to actually understand. For once in my life, I get to say a character's normal attacks are not the usual. At base, she does just have 6 normal strikes, but this is where Bond of Life comes out. If Bond of Life is above 30%, Arlecchino gains Pyro Infusion, 40% Pyro damage bonus, and a damage buff based on how high Bond of Life is. Hitting enemies will drain some of that Bond of Life though. But how do you even get it? Good question. For that we have her skill. Her skill will hit an enemy, clear her Bond of Life and heal her, and then finally mark the enemy. This mark does Pyro damage once every 3 seconds, and when this happens, the mark will get stronger. When marked enemies are hit by Arlecchino's charge attack, Arlecchino will gain a certain amount of Bond of Life, based on the mark strength, 20, 25, or 70%. Arlecchino's burst is a lot less interesting, but still needs to be considered. It's just a big hit of Pyro damage, but it also gives 15% of Bond of Life. Don't sleep on it though, since it can do a lot of damage. This is where it would normally cover her Ascension 1, but I already did. Her Ascension 1 is the mark getting stronger, but I felt that it was needed to cover that with the skill itself. But that's not all though. When Arlecchino kills an enemy affected by her E's mark, she gets an additional 70% Bond of Life. Her Ascension 4 in comparison is a lot more boring. She gets resistance to every element based on her attack, up to 20%. This will help her since her Bond of Life can easily lower HP to incredibly low levels. But why not just use a healer, you ask? Well, about that. Her Exploration passive makes it so allies genuinely cannot heal her in combat. This is very useful if you ask me though, since Bond of Life just gets deleted if you heal it off, which also deletes Arlecchino's damage. Her normal attacks are very obviously the core of her kit, and those need to be leveled first because of it. Her ult can hit pretty hard, so level that next. Her skill doesn't seem that important, since it just exists to give her stacks, so I would level that last. Now we get to her Constellations, and her C1 is already interesting. 33% of the time when you normal attack, instead of draining Bond of Life, you will gain more. If you ask me, this is less there for her infusion to last longer, since your buffs will run out eventually, but more so about the damage increase of simply having more Bond of Life. Now her C2 is a lot more interesting and a lot more unique. Her E mark will start out at level 2, which doesn't seem that good. But what is cool is the next part. When you charge attack an enemy with a level 3 mark, you get a nuke of Pyro damage. I'm talking a multiplier higher than Zhongli's burst, and this can be vaped, VV buffed, everything. This thing can hit hard. C4s have a history of being mid, and I think this is one of them as well. Her burst will now give you 10% more Bond of Life, and increases the mark level on enemies by 1. When you cover a level 3 mark, her ult's cooldown gets reduced, and she gets energy. Now there's her C6. It increases the multiplier of Arlecchino's E by 500%, multiplied by Bond of Life. Keep in mind that Bond of Life doesn't have a duration, so this will work every rotation. And for 20 seconds after her E, Arlecchino's normal attacks will gain 10% crit rate and 70% crit damage. This sounds very much like Alhaitham's C6, which can let him do some pretty silly speedruns. So I expect Arlecchino to be around the same level as that. And then, like I always do, cover the signature weapon. Sadly, they yet again gave us a weapon with a very niche buff or condition that makes it unusable on most characters. When a charge attack hits an enemy, the wielder gets 25% Bond of Life. When you do have Bond of Life, you get 12% damage bonus, with an additional 20% if the Bond of Life is stronger than 30%. This is obviously made for Arlecchino, and it's way better than anything else. It's pretty similarly powerful as Chiori's weapon for her, but unlike Chiori, Arlecchino doesn't need this to function. I do strongly recommend getting it to the Arlecchino mains, but if you aren't that committed to her, I wouldn't roll for it if I were you. She does also have a signature artifact set, which 2-piece boosts attack, and then gives 18% damage bonus when Bond of Life changes, stacking up to 3 times. This is slightly worse than Marechaussee, but Marechaussee is likely not going to actually work on her, so this is going to be her best in slot by a pretty large margin. If you made it this far, you seem to be interested in my content, so subscribe and like if you do. Since we don't actually know Arlecchino's particle generation, I cannot tell you about her energy recharge requirements, but her ult does seem to be pretty minor, so it might just be better to ult every rotation if her energy recharge requirements end up being too high. For her teams, I expect her to be slot in either Vape teams with Dylan, since no healing passive makes her actively anti-Furina, or maybe Chevreuse teams. I do wonder how people will react to the fact that she straight up says no to Furina, since that Furina changed the metagame so much. Think of all the best teams right now. Hu Tao, Navia, Nouvelette, Zhao, Linny, all of them want to use Furina. So it really is a breath of fresh air that Arlecchino looks at that and straight up rejects it. Also, the inclusion of Chevreuse makes it so she does have some team variety and is not just forced to slot in Vape. While the top DPS of these overload teams with Chevreuse are most likely going to be less than Vaporize, it does still have the possibility of being better in some scenarios because it means you no longer have to worry about ICD, which means getting hit and dodging is a lot more realistic. This is a big problem that Yoimiya has, where a lot of people just straight up force a shielder into the team because you need to keep her ICDs up. Chevreuse changed this so you don't really need to do that, so it's probably the same for Arlecchino. And sadly, as one of the biggest Bennett haters on the planet, I do think that Arlecchino is going to use Bennett. She is very much an attack scaling DPS, and since she is Pyro, she does appreciate the 15% Pyro damage bonus. So, Bennett seems a little unavoidable. And normally, you wouldn't want to use Bennett with her because he heals Bond of Life away, but Arlecchino has that passive that just straight up makes it so she can't be healed by teammates. So there is basically no problems here, aside from the obvious circle impact, but we're just gonna have to deal with that. Other options for her teams are probably Vaporize Plunge, which should just work as normal, but this should just be better because she does boost plunge damage as well with her Bond of Life passive. She also has just pyro damage bonus built into her kit. I'm glad Arlecchino is good, and her being straight up anti-Furina is very interesting, and it's even better to see that she still performs quite well without her. While I don't plan on getting her, she is very unique, and sadly she's also really annoying to calc. But that's gonna be all from me. Peace.